This episode of The Answer is Yes Baja Sessions is brought to you by Baja Bound Insurance Services. Driving to Mexico? You can buy and print out your Mexican auto insurance policy online in minutes with their easy-to-use website. They also have great travel information to help you plan your trip south of the border. Visit bajabound.com.
Hello, this is Ryan Thomas, and you're listening to the Baja Sessions. Over the last 3 decades, I've lived, worked, and played from the top to the tip of the majestic peninsula of Baja, California. And because of this, I've met some incredibly interesting people with equally interesting stories. And today on the Baja Sessions, we're going to chat with one of them. Chris Johnson, welcome to the Baja Sessions. How you doing today?
I'm doing excellent. Thank you, Ryan, for including me in your podcast.
Oh, man, I'm so stoked to do this. This is my good friend, CJ, and we're going to get into that. I started to ask you CJ or Chris before we started recording, and you started to tell me the story, and I said stop because I wanted to hear it for the first time while I'm recording. So I've known CJ for, probably close to 20 years now, and I kind of consider him and his wife, both my wife and I consider you guys our Baja parents. So good friends of ours from Baja. And Chris has lived, in some ways, what I would call an idyllic life. And today, I'm assuming you're sitting in your house there, right on the sand, in front of Zippers in San Jose del Cabo. Is that right?
That's correct.
Well, let's start off with this one, CJ. You've been there full time for close to 20-something years, and you've had the property there on the beach in front of Zippers in San Jose since when?
I first found it back in 1984 on a surf trip I took with a good friend of mine from Lake Tahoe, and I fell in love with the place. And so I knew that I needed to come back and check it out again, and I did. And the property was for sale. And so I looked into it, and before I knew it, I was involved with a man who was representing the owner, a man named Carlos Manuel Gonzalez Cefeña out of San Jose del Cabo. And he gave me the ins on it and told me kind of what I was going to have to do. And at that time, there was no real bank trusts that were available, or, the way that people held title wasn't really that common. So I made a deal with the guy, and eventually ended up going to Tijuana and spoke with the trust department head, Bank Homer Bank, and he set me up. And a year and a half later, I got a phone call, and they said my trust, which is the way it's an instrument for holding title here in Mexico for people who don't live here full time or that aren't nationals, told me to come up and get my trust, and which I did. And then I moved down here in late 1986 and decided that I should build a house. And so I spent 2 years here building the house on the beach here and getting to surf a lot in between projects. So that's kind of how it got started.
Let's back up, though, because I know you've told me this story before. And your surf trip wasn't actually to Baja, was it? Weren't you on mainland and you just happened to ride the ferry or something across and stumbled into the area not really knowing there was surf here? Was that right?
Yeah, that's exactly how it was, really. We'll back it up a little bit, before I ever even really got here, I had been traveling mainland Mexico, going down the west coast quite a ways, and I ran into some people in Puerto Vallarta out on a point called Punta Mita, and he told me about this place, and I ended up going with another couple and came over here to the Baja, and that's basically how I discovered it. The surf trip came later, and basically was the time actually that I saw that the property was for sale. But it started really from my expeditions and adventures down into mainland Mexico back even earlier in the early part of 1980.
But you had spent a childhood, if I remember right. Haven't you told stories of going and camping down on like by Estero Beach outside of Ensenada with your parents? Am I remembering right about that?
That's completely correct, Brian. I started actually coming to Mexico in about 1955 with my parents. They loved Mexico, and they had a group of friends that used to come down and camp at a place called Estero Beach, which was south of Ensenada, near a point called Punta Banda. And as a child, we used to come down and spend the months, every month of August, for probably 10 to 15 years. It started my love for Mexico and got me really felt comfortable being here and learning the ins and outs of the language and the people and the culture and everything. So my love for Baja started, yes, as a youth when I was about 5 years old. And then as time went on, I just kept going and kept coming down and figured out a way to get into this country one way or the other. And it became a passion for me. And being a surfer all my life, it was one of the most attractive places that I could get to from San Diego. So that's what I did.
So trips to Estero Beach with your family when you were 5, and if I'm not mistaken, you're staring 70 in the face here real soon, aren't you?
I'm turning 70 on July 30th. It's been a long, interesting ride.
So 65 years of getting to know, falling in love, and becoming one with Baja, I think we could say, right?
Very, very true.
So over the last 35, 40 years or so that you've been spending time in Cabo, or San Jose for that matter, I know, I'm not even going to say I guess. I know because I've seen your pictures. You've seen a few things change throughout the years. In fact, your house on the beach there. If anybody has, let's clarify this for people that maybe are not aware of when I say zippers in San Jose, what I mean. And basically, what is it, maybe 2 miles outside of San Jose Central, where the town square is, out along the coastline. So the Costa Azul area is what that area is known for, and there's an arroyo that runs out from the canyons out onto the beach and creates an amazing sandbar with a reef there for those of you guys that are surfers. And there is a wave that's called zippers there, and it's called zippers because it zips along the shoreline when it's doing it right. But CJ's been there, I think, were you the first or second home there on the beach for miles?
Yes, that's true. There was one house that was over to the south, which is near the Cabo Surf Hotel, and it was built by a man named Jim Kirby, and he had built it actually in the 50s, and he was one of the very, very first Americans that had ever built in this area. And so when I came along, the beach was basically deserted. And when I got my property, it was about 1.5 miles to the nearest campsite, and there was a small trailer park to my north. And so the entire beach was isolated, desolate, and it seemed like a perfect place for me to, start my adventure.
Your early retirement.
Yeah, I mean, the first 10 years I wasn't really able to come down because I had businesses up in California, up in the United States. But I would come down usually 3 or 4 months in the spring and in the fall because, as surfers know, those were the years where we're chasing the big south swells that come out of the South Pacific. And so we made that a sojourn every year to come down and surf those waves. And in those days, there was really hardly anyone here. There was a group of surfers who had gotten here in the late 70s. One of the famous ones was Mike Doyle, and there was about 3 or 4 other guys that showed up right above one of the surf breaks here called The Rock, up on a place called Gringo Hill. And they had started to build a small little community up on the hill.
They started to colonize it.
The beach had never been...
Yeah, they were the colonizers. Those guys that started to colonize that area out there.
They truly were. Yeah, they were the pioneers of this whole area. I mean, for people who were living, there was fishermen who had come down earlier, like probably in the 60s, even in the 50s, and had hung out at some of the great hotels along the beach here that were built back in the 50s. But they really weren't doing much surfing. So the first surfing groups showed up in the 70s. And but they all built up on the hill. And so when I got here, I noticed that this place was for sale, and I jumped at it, and I was fortunate enough to secure around 2,000 meters, about a half an acre here on the beach.
So I think it's kind of interesting, CJ, the today, if you've been in the area, and you almost would miss your house because there's so much that's been built around it now. There's condominiums to the north, and there's new condominiums to the south, and as pretty much as far as you can. There's not very many stretches of beach that don't have something built on it. And today, one would look at your house and go, "Oh, that's kind of odd. There's a decent-sized house right in the middle of all of this." But I think you could also say the same thing 35, 40 years ago. You go, "Oh, that's kind of odd. There's a house right in the middle of nothing. There's nothing here. It's just kind of odd that there's a house there." And now it's still kind of odd that there's a house there. It's just because there's condominiums and hotels all around.
That's true. And like I said, when I built this and when I bought the property, the entire beach was vacant. And today, there's a 6-story condo to my south, 3-story condos to my north, and then the entire beach is basically filled, with hotels and everything. They started moving in probably around 1990, and it's been continual and really had a burst of growth in 2014 after the famous Odile hurricane that decimated our area.
Yeah.
For some reason, they all decided, let's get going after the hurricane. And so we've seen a tremendous amount of growth in the last 4 or 5 years.
All right, let's get personal now. I've known you for a long time, so we're just going to do this. I know you have gone back and forth watching the growth, watching the development, and it basically came down right on top of you here recently with the development to the south of you. And last time we spoke about this, you had found some peace of mind in dealing with all of it. And I think, the listeners here, we've talked about all different types of things, had a ton of different guests on. But I look to you as somebody that is always trying to manage themselves and how they think and how they feel and how they view the world. And having a concrete jungle built around your paradise could have done a lot of different things to you psychologically, spiritually. And I think at times it has. We've had our discussions where you're frustrated and pissed, but the last time we spoke, it seemed that you were at a place of peace with all of this and kind of absorbing it. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, like you said, the growth has been gradual up until about 5 or 6 years ago. And the lot next door to me that was basically, a little bit larger than my lot had been empty for 30 years. And these developers got a hold of it and they started building. And the sad thing about it is that they decided that they had to build on every square inch of it. So they put their building like almost right up against my property line. So the first couple of years was very, very disheartening and very difficult for me because not only was the actual construction being done, but it was in the manner that they did it. And they really did without respect. And so I had really to overcome my anger. And it was actually a great learning experience for me because it's one of those things that, if you can't control it, then in some way you have to accept it, even though I did get some help both legally and emotionally to handle it. And so as time's gone by, I've really mellowed to the fact that it is what it is. There's been a lot of growth down here. The longer you live, the more change you see. And so maybe it was given to me as one of my great life lessons because now I just look at it. I just keep putting up more trees, and I just keep looking out toward the ocean, which is really the most important thing and the most beautiful thing.
And, I mean, we can't avoid the topic of the fact that you're also a speculator. You bought and sold land, built stuff and sold stuff. I'm fascinated by the different ways that you found to support and sustain yourself down there. You didn't necessarily move to Mexico with millions of dollars in the bank. I know that about you. And you've built a solid business with your home there, even before Airbnb and VRBO, really, didn't you? And let's talk about that. You've got a 3-story home there that's divided up into 3 different units on each level. And, so it's the name, and tell us a little bit about that.
Well, back in the early 2000s, I was approached by a man who was actually already renting properties